Hello, everyone. Once again, this is Pastor Terry Reese of the Valley Grace Brethren Church of Armagh, Pennsylvania. And as always, we deem it a high privilege to be with you for our time of study and reflection. And we are continuing this week with our studies on the sanctity of human life. We have focused on various areas in our society in which we are not seeing human life being honored. We are looking at certain pernicious trends in our modern culture in which human dignity is not recognized. As always, with these studies, we begin with two basic principles. Number one, human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. And we are commanded to recognize this, to recognize what the Lord clearly stated when he created man and woman in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And secondly, there is another great principle that we must always bear in mind when we're dealing with these issues. We are commanded to love our neighbor. That is the royal law, as James calls it. And our Lord Jesus Christ essentially distilled the commands of God in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 39, down to the fact that we are to, number one, the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. But there is a second great command, like unto it, that we are to love our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? Paul somewhat expounds on that in Galatians 6:10. Paul writes, "So then, as we have opportunity," underline that word, opportunity, "let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." And of course, as we had said in the previous message, opportunity implies obligation. As we have the opportunity to do good to someone, that makes them our neighbor, and thus we are required, we have the obligation to do good unto that person, not evil. But we have a society that is filled with evil. We looked at this matter of abortion in several messages, how this involves the destruction of innocent blood, the destruction and abuse of those who are weak, innocent, and without power, the most powerless and disadvantaged amongst us. And in the last couple of weeks, we began looking at this matter of euthanasia, a growing concern in Western culture. And all these things are crimes against the powerless, the most disadvantaged amongst us, the elderly, the infirm, the physically challenged, the mentally challenged, the unborn, the very young. You know, it's a measure of a society's humanity, how it treats the most helpless and powerless amongst us. Are we kind to them, or do we exploit and abuse them? You know, the Lord is very clear in his word that this is the kind of thing that draws his wrath, his ire, the destruction of human blood. This is a great abomination to him. Hands that shed innocent blood. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 and 17. So as we're continuing to talk about this matter of euthanasia, I'll just quickly remind you the progress that we made. And by the way, if you haven't seen our earlier messages, I would strongly encourage you to do so, as this message is building upon the things that we talked about there. But in our earlier messages, we defined this matter of euthanasia, which is a term that means good death, kind of a euphemism. It involves the deliberate intervention into the life of a suffering person with the express intent of terminating that person's life. So it involves deliberate intervention, and there is that express intent to hasten that person's death unnaturally. And we talked about different types of euthanasia: voluntary euthanasia, non-voluntary euthanasia, where a person is unable to give open consent, whether it be due to the fact that they don't have the mental capacity, or very young. Also, there is involuntary euthanasia, which was practiced in Nazi Germany, where people were actually killed against their will. We also talked about how this matter is growing in the modern world. There are a variety of nations that now actively practice some form of either euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. The Benelux countries have been doing this for about 20 years. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. They're very far down the road, especially the Netherlands, which even allows for the non-voluntary euthanasia of children. We also see countries like some of the states of Australia. Canada is very, very, very far down the road. Their euthanasia program has only been going on for 7 years, but it really is quite remarkable, astounding what is happening in the Great White North. In fact, in a couple weeks, we're going to use the Canadian situation as kind of an ensign for what can happen to a nation as it goes down the so-called slippery slope. If the slippery slope ever applied, it applies to the nation of Canada. But there are other nations, Colombia, Spain, and Portugal, which also allow for some form of active voluntary euthanasia. Active means, by the way, that something is deliberately done. There is a lethal substance provided to a patient. This is kind of differentiated from passive euthanasia, in which a person is put to death through the withholding of food or fluids. And here in the United States, as we think about Canada, can the United States be far behind? Right now, there are 10 legal jurisdictions within our country that allow for some form of physician-assisted suicide. And this in certain areas, parts of the world, we indeed have come far down the road. In our second message, we talked about it was more of a devotional message, where we talked about how the Lord has appointed suffering in our lives for a reason, and that God is sovereign over our lives. He is in control. He jealously guards the prerogative of measuring a person's lifespan. He is in charge of life and death. We're going to get more into that issue next week, though, this matter of God's sovereign prerogatives. But last week we were looking at really how there is indeed redemption to be found within suffering, particularly for the Christian believer, that this is not something that has caught God by surprise, that this suffering comes into our life for a reason. This week we are kind of getting into a history. Our focus is more historical. We're looking at how we got here, which really should give us an indication of where we're going. I just want to give a brief history today of this matter of euthanasia, this matter of active euthanasia, which is murder and sin. let's be very clear here. This involves, again, let me redefine what euthanasia is, so that you can differentiate between this and the matter of simply letting nature take its course, which is not necessarily sinful. Euthanasia involves deliberate intervention. Underline that. Deliberate intervention by a healthcare individual or someone else with the express intent, underline that, express intent of terminating a human life, hastening a person's death. It's not like we're withholding some treatment that's no longer doing the person any good and prolonging suffering or anything like this. Euthanasia is a deliberate act of homicide or assisted suicide. Now, in terms of how we've gotten here, let's go back to pagan antiquity. You know that pagan Greece and pagan Rome had little regard for the sanctity of human life in general. These were not Christian cultures. These were not cultures that were formed on the idea that all men are created equal, that all men are created in the image and likeness of God, which is the basis of human equality. The Judeo-Christian ethic was absent from these cultures. It's not that they didn't have some virtue. All cultures have some level of virtue, but they were not under the influence of God's Word. How we need God's Word if we are going to lay the foundations for a humane and just society. But evidence of the fact that the Greeks and the Romans had little regard for the sanctity of human life can be seen in their practices. Abortion was widely practiced, and infanticide. Of course, the Romans were very famous for taking unwanted children or undesirable children up into the hills and putting them in a basket and leaving them there for the wolves. This was called the exposure of infants, out and out infanticide. Murder or creating a condition where a child would be left to their own devices, that was very popular, and the Romans saw nothing wrong with it. Of course, you think about their grisly forms of entertainment. That undergirds their how cheap human life was to the Romans. Think about the gladiator shows, just outrageous, massive horror shows. The slaughter was unbelievable. Some of these events, some of these circuses would go on for protracted periods of time, like that of the Emperor Titus. And the spilling of blood is just incalculable, both of man and beast. And of course, both the Greeks and the Romans tended to have very favorable views when it came to the matter of suicide. They embraced the idea of suicide under certain circumstances. The Stoic philosophy, which was very popular in Rome, saw suicide as a very noble thing. And also the Romans encouraged suicide under various circumstances. Say if you got into political trouble with the emperor, suicide was seen as a kind of an honorable way out. And of course, going back further to the Greeks, the great Greek philosopher, kind of the prototype of Greek philosophers, Socrates committed suicide by drinking hemlock. And what's very interesting is their medicine, which of course came out, which was part of their culture, accommodated this suicidal impulse, this murderous impulse. Doctors were as much killers as they were healers. They were abortionists. They practiced euthanasia on a wide scale. They poisoned people. They killed people. They were as much professional assassins as they were healers. This was the nature of Grecian and Roman medicine. This was the ethic that undergirded most of their medical schools, except for one. There was an exception, a very noteworthy exception. There was a certain Grecian physician by the name of Hippocrates. You probably heard that name in connection with the Hippocratic oath. Hippocrates of Kos, born in the year 460 BC, died in the year 370 BC. But the thing that caused Hippocrates and his doctors to stand out was their code of ethics. Hippocrates and his doctors, the school of doctors that came out of him, they did not kill. That was their great distinctive. They refused to kill. And as you look at the Hippocratic oath, which really distills the basic principles that were taught by Hippocrates, there was the promotion there of a really sound system of ethics that even we as Christians can solidly appreciate. This oath of his, the famous Hippocratic oath, it promotes the ethics of, number one, confidentiality. The relationship between a doctor and a patient is a sacred one, and the doctor is to keep things confidential. Number two, the oath promoted the ethic of beneficence, the idea that you do good for your neighbor. Certainly that's something that we as Christians can appreciate. And number three, the oath promoted the idea of non-malfeasance. Do not do harm to a patient. The oath, the Hippocratic oath, is considered to be the earliest formal expression of professional medical ethics that we see coming out of the Western world. And again, it came out of a general culture, Grecian culture, that did not have a high regard for human life. But it established a system of principles, a system of ethics that have not only become influential in terms of Western medicine, but also in terms of Western jurisprudence. This has had a great impact on our legal system, traditionally, this Hippocratic oath. The Hippocratic oath drew a clear, distinct, bold line between healing on the one hand and killing on the other. And you see, that's the problem today in the Western world. We've kind of lost that clear distinction. Doctors are to heal, never to kill. That line cannot be violated. But I just want to read a couple passages from the original Hippocratic oath. It begins with a swearing unto various deities. Of course, Hippocrates and his ancient Greek doctors were not Christians, but they did swear by heaven their understanding of the divine. They swore by the god Apollo, who was in charge of the medical arts, and by Asclepius, the patron god of doctors, and by Hygeia and Panacea and other medical gods. They took this oath in the name of these gods, and The oath continues, I quote, I will use those dietary regimens which will benefit my patients according to my greatest ability and judgment, and, note this, I will do no harm or injustice to them, unquote. So notice that. You have the ethic of beneficence. I will do good. And the ethic of non-malfeasance. I will not do harm. This was the great primary motto behind the Hippocratic school. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. It was very important to the doctors of this school because, again, it differentiated them from their colleagues in other medical schools who saw it as part of their job to kill people, to administer poisons and toxins, to carry out euthanasia, and to commit abortions. Let me read a few more passages from the original Hippocratic oath. I will do no harm or injustice to them, the patients. Neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course, unquote. In other words, no euthanasia. No euthanasia. That was not an option at all. The oath continues, quote, similarly, I will not give to a woman an abortive remedy, unquote. No abortions. The doctor who took the Hippocratic oath swore a solemn vow unto heaven that he would never, under any circumstances, commit an abortion. My, how the medical arts have fallen, haven't they? It's sobering when you read this thing. Continuing, quote, in purity and holiness I will guard my life and my art. Stop there a moment. You see how Hippocrates really saw the medical arts as kind of a sacred calling, something that was to be carried out with the highest ethics in mind. He continues, quote, into whatsoever house I enter, I will enter to help the sick. Underline that, to help the sick. And I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, and in particular of sexual relations with both female and male persons, be they free or slaves, especially from abusing the bodies of men or women, bond or free, unquote. So notice this, in a culture that treated human beings like chattel, like property, the physician, the Hippocratic physician, takes a solemn oath unto heaven that he will not sexually abuse a patient, that he will not exploit a patient. You note here when he talks about abusing their people's bodies. Think about doctors today, just sterilizing young people in terms of this whole sex change thing. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, how far modern neo-pagans have lapsed even from the ethics of the ancient pagans. The Hippocratic oath continues, quote, now, if I carry out this oath and break it not, may I gain forever reputation among all men for my life and for my art. But if I break it and forswear myself, may the opposite befall me, unquote. In other words, the person taking the oath is speaking a potential blessing unto themselves and a potential cursing if they should lapse from the demands of this oath, if they should carry out euthanasia or abortion or engage in sexual misconduct or do any sort of harm to a patient, even if it be a slave. Those were the high standards that the doctors that took the Hippocratic oath in antiquity joined themselves to. Again, I want to underline the three major points of emphasis here. Number one, no euthanasia. I will do no harm. That's what we call non-malfeasance. In a work entitled Epidemics, Book 1, which came out of the Hippocratic school, we read this, quote, "Practice two things in your dealings with disease. Either help or do no harm to the patient," unquote. First, do no harm. That was the basic ethic of the Hippocratic school. Number two, second major point of emphasis, no abortion. No abortion. Now, there were certain moderate schools that did allow for abortion if the life of the mother was in jeopardy, but essentially the Hippocratic school stood firmly for no abortion. You have, for example, the testimony of an ancient doctor, Scribonius Largus, who was a physician to the Emperor Claudius, who affirmed that no abortion under any circumstances was to be entertained. Number three, and third point of emphasis, notice that the doctor was required to take an oath unto heaven. The idea is that man is accountable unto heaven. Again, the ancient Greeks did not understand, did not know the true God, but they did understand that there was a realm of the sacred, and that man was in some way accountable unto heaven. And so the Hippocratic physician understood that there were three parties involved with a person's treatment. Number one, the patient. Number two, the doctor. And number three, God. See, God plays a role here. We are accountable unto God. You see, that's the lost component today. God has been expelled from the equation. That's the problem in today's medicine. We see the doctor and we see the patient. God isn't involved, but instead the modern God, the state, and also the insurance companies, the money people, they're the de facto gods of today. How much of your health care today, by the way, is determined by the money people, the insurances, and by the government as the government becomes more and more involved. You know, friends, as we move closer and closer to socialized medicine, you'll see that we will have really very little rights when it comes to our health care. That's the dark future that we're heading to. But according to Hippocrates and to those doctors, those ancient doctors that subscribed to his school, the doctor in essence was to be a God-fearer who operates his practice in reference to the laws and demands of heaven. Heaven played a role in this. So, in short, the Hippocratic concept of the doctor, the model doctor, was that he was to be a man of piety who saw his art as a holy calling and who abided by the highest ethical and professional standards. A man who venerated human life from the moment of its conception until the time of its natural termination. Note that. These doctors who took that oath promised that they would never perform an abortion. They respected life from the moment of conception. And they promised that they would never perform an act of euthanasia. They were willing to allow life to naturally take its course until the point of its natural termination. It is not for us to kill people. That is to be left unto the realm of heaven. That was the Hippocratic concept, and it, of course, as the Christian centuries unfolded, obviously there was complete agreement here in terms of the Christian ethic and in terms of the sanctity of human life and the idea that the doctor was to do no harm. And thus the Hippocratic school is the one that became dominant in the Christian centuries, not the various pagan schools of medicine that were rivals to Hippocrates. And that became the long-lasting standard for Western medicine through the Christian era, at least through what we call the nominal Christian era, from the time that the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity up until modern times, what we call modernity, when the ideologies of Freud and Darwin and Marx became intruded into Western civilization and things changed. This Hippocratic ideal became the de facto code of standards for Western medicine. In the early post-World War II era, after the Nazis had done so much to defile medicine, the SS doctors with their hideous human experiments and their engaging in mass murder, people like Dr. Mengele, who was very prominent in the Auschwitz death camp, and you had the resulting doctors' trials after World War II. The Western world drafted a document called the Declaration of Geneva in 1948 to reaffirm the general Hippocratic ideal. And you read in that Declaration of Geneva, the 1948 edition, this passage, quote, "I will maintain the utmost respect for human life. From the time of conception," note that, "from the time of conception, even under threat, I will not use my medical knowledge contrary to the laws of humanity," unquote. It's a sad commentary on our time, by the way, that in 1983, the clause that explicitly precludes abortion, the conception clause, was removed. Of course, that's a clear nod to today's political correctness. That phrase, "from the time of conception," no longer is part of this Declaration of Geneva as of 1983. Again, just showing how the times have changed. But today, you see this in various manifestations of how this Hippocratic oath has been set aside. For example, think about the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision, that outlandish decision by the United States Supreme Court, which not only was bad ethics and bad medicine, but also bad law, which is why it was swept aside recently by the Dobbs decision. But in 1973, in conjunction with the Roe versus Wade decision, the United States Supreme Court openly, note this, openly rejected the Hippocratic Oath, explicitly rejected the Hippocratic Oath as a guide to modern medical ethics and modern medical practices. The court stated that the oath is incapable of covering the latest modern developments and methods of medical practice and research. In other words, the Hippocratic Oath, according to the wisdom of the Supreme Court, that went out with the dinosaurs. That went out with Alley-oop and the cavemen. It's not for people today. The modern world has changed. The Hippocratic Oath is not to be seen as something binding. Of course, the Hippocratic Oath came up as an issue when the Roe v. Wade case was decided. The Hippocratic Oath explicitly condemning abortion. And yet here you have a Supreme Court that sought to legalize abortion and sweep aside all these state laws that were against abortion. So naturally, the court had to reject the Hippocratic Oath as a standard. So there you see that's really a huge issue when it comes to modern medicine, the setting aside of the Hippocratic ethic. And this is also reflected in what's going on in your modern medical schools. You know, modern medical schools, they still all seem to require some kind of oath for young doctors to take. And yet it's interesting to examine what these oaths that they're taking today, what they consist of. In 1993, a survey was taken, and different times they've taken these surveys where they've monitored what kind of oaths modern doctors are taking when they graduate. And this 1993 survey, they examined 150 U.S. and medical schools and examined the oaths. And what they found was quite interesting. Of these various oaths that were being taken, only 14% of these modern oaths that they're taking, not the Hippocratic oath, prohibit euthanasia. Okay? Only 14% of these oaths that young doctors were taking as of 1993 prohibited euthanasia. Only 11% of these oaths involved some sort of covenant with a deity. In other words, the idea that I am accountable to heaven. Only 8% forswore abortion. Okay, so that means 92% of the oaths that were being taken in these 150 medical schools had no problem with abortion. Abortion's not mentioned. Only 8% of the oaths in the 1993 survey rejected abortion. And only 3%, this is interesting, forbade sexual contact with patients. So all these things, whether it be non-abusive patients, keeping chaste before patients, not committing an abortion, not hastening human death, all these maxims were held sacred, of course, in the original classic version of the Hippocratic Oath, but they have been set aside in these modified oaths. Again, in 2018, another such survey was taken to see what kind of oaths young medical students are taking. And the various medical schools that they examined, none of them used the original Hippocratic Oath. Interesting. A modified oath, or an oath that was unique to that particular school, was generally what was employed. And one critic, in examining 18 of these oaths, criticized these oaths for their variability. In other words, there was no standard. Everybody's taking a different kind of oath. Just depends on what school you go to. And he wrote, quote, "Consistency would help society see that physicians are members of a profession that is committed to a shared set of essential ethical values," unquote. You see, that's the problem when everybody's taking a different kind of oath or a different homemade oath. There's no shared set of ethical values. You see, we're just in the same position today that Israel was during the times of the judges. The nation had no king, and every man did as he saw fit, what was right in his own eyes. And that's the chaos of modern medicine. That's the chaos of our culture today. We live in a post-modern era where there is no truth, where truth is non-discoverable. Everything is relative. Everything is subjective. You know, today we can't even agree that there is a truth, that there are only two genders, male and female. Today you look at charts on the internet where they're trying to tell you there are potentially 57 or more different genders. There's just no truth. This is a postmodern era that rejects the basic concept of veritas, truth. I want to talk then about this brave new world that we've gotten into in terms of the history of euthanasia. We begin to see, with the setting aside of the Judeo-Christian ethic, with the rise of the Gilded Age and the Progressive eras, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, a whole new ethic began to take shape with regard to medicine. And that's when all this modern talk about euthanasia, all this euthanasia advocacy begins. The Gilded Age, this period of our history, the late 1800s, coming out of the, rising out of the post-Civil War prosperity, an era where the theories of Charles Darwin had begun to catch on, and many of the powerful industrialists latched on to some of these ideas, and some of the social philosophers and the educators. A whole new ethic was taking place. The Bible was to be set aside in its primitive Hebrew ethic, its sentimental Hebrew ethic. A new Darwinian ethic was emerging. Man is the measure of all things. A new humanism was beginning to emerge. But in the Gilded Age and its successor era, the Progressive era, we begin to see the rise of modern euthanasia as the sanctity, the traditional Christian sanctity of life ethic falls by the wayside. So let's look at some of these skeletons in the closet, so to speak. By the way, that term, do you know where that expression, skeletons in the closet, comes from? It comes from a period like in the late 1800s or earlier, when cadavers were sometimes illegally obtained by doctors unethically and then stored in skeletons. So indeed, perhaps it is an apt term when we look at some of the dark history of the Gilded Age and of the Progressive era. I should define the Progressive era. The Progressive era, there you see the rise of the idea that man is progressing, as the word progressive would indicate. Christian dogmas such as original sin were to be set aside. The idea that we need God in His sanctifying presence is to be set aside. The idea is that man is wonderful and that we are being guided by an impersonal force of evolution and history that is guiding us on to greater things. Human perfectibility was the idea behind progressivism. And it's out of that culture that many dark things began to emerge. But just to trace where the modern euthanasia, in terms of much of it, this ethic comes out of the United States and Britain. It's not for no reason that Adolf Hitler praised theorists coming out of the United States in the Progressive era for helping to shape his own thought. Start here, 1870, a man named Samuel Williams, during the Gilded Age, a non-physician, first popularly proposed using a cocktail of anesthetics and morphine combined to intentionally end a patient's life because of pain and suffering. Again, the Christian idea that pain and suffering is something that is ordained of God and comes from God and can be used for a holy, divine purpose, that there's something redemptive in suffering, that is set aside. All suffering is to be avoided, and patients are to be put to sleep like animals. Then we see the famous, I should say notorious atheist, Robert Ingersoll, who lived from 1833 to 1899, making public pleas for euthanasia for painful diseases. Now, Ingersoll was an interesting character. He was famous for making all kinds of speeches all across the country attacking the Bible. He was famous for putting on these theatrical displays where he would say, "If there's a God, let him strike me dead in 5 minutes." He would take out his watch and he would open it up and he would look at it and he would look up to heaven, and of course the crowd would be shuddering at the audacity of this man. What's going to happen? The 5 minutes would elapse, and then Ingersoll would close up his pocket watch. "Well, friends, I'm still here. I guess that means that there's no God. And I guess that means you need to give up your primitive, absurd superstition and move on." Ingersoll was famous for these kind of outlandish, dramatic displays. But anyway, he was one of the early advocates for euthanasia, unsurprisingly. Then later, in 1891, Felix Adler, who was a very prominent educator, also called for lethal drugs to be administered to terminally ill patients upon their voluntary request. Well, at least he believed in voluntary euthanasia. But it's interesting, much of the debate during this period, the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, much of the debate, while it focused on voluntary euthanasia, there were also many calls for involuntary euthanasia. These pleas were vocalized as well. Some people just are too stupid to know that they're better off dead. We need involuntary euthanasia. Some people need to be put to death against their better judgment. So there were demands not only for voluntary euthanasia, but in some cases involuntary euthanasia. Those ideas were out there in this country among the progressive elites during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. This is how these elites, these progressive elites, were talking back then. Of course, the same crowd, you understand, is running the world today. The progressive elites that are running all of our establishments, our educational establishments, our political establishments, our cultural establishments, our entertainment establishments, now our military establishment. Sad to say, all these woke generals. The progressivism is dominating the world, at least the elites of this world today. And that's why the world is in the shape that it's in large measure. But we then see in 1900, the turn of the century, the beginning of progress, we see a well-known New York physician by the name of W. Duncan McKim, M-C-K-I-M, McKim, publishing a notorious book entitled Heredity and Human Progress. This book, by the way, Heredity and Human Progress by McKim, you can access on Internet Archive. Internet Archive is a wonderful, vast library that has preserved so many old books that have gone out of print for years, taken photo scans of them. It's a wonderful resource, and it really it's just one of these things that's keeping alive our heritage and our history, and including the dark parts of our history. Sad thing, by the way, some people are trying to shut it down. But in this book, Heredity and Human Progress, Dr. McKim, suggests that those who have severe inherited defects, those who have mental issues, the people living in the asylums, epileptics, people like this with these kind of severe medical conditions, as well as those who are social pariahs, those who have various incurable social difficulties like drunkards and incorrigible criminals, that all of these should be humanely killed using carbonic gas, which he thought would be the best and most humane way to do it. Now, this man's writing in 1900, 4 decades before Adolf Hitler actually did these things. Okay, this was a man who was well ahead of his time. Let me read you a passage from McKim's book that I found. He writes, quote, "The surest, the simplest, the kindest, and most humane means for preventing reproduction among those whom we deem unworthy of this high privilege is a gentle, painless death. And this should be administered not as a punishment, but as an expression of enlightened pity for the victims, too defective by nature to find true happiness in life, and as a duty toward the community and towards our own offspring," unquote. Friends, Adolf Hitler could have written the same passage. It's a duty to put these poor unfortunates to death, these people who are unworthy of the high privilege of reproducing themselves. The only thing we can do is get rid of them. Those who have bad blood, those who will pass on their genetic defects. Note the Darwinism that underlines all this. Those who, for one reason or another, through genetic disposition, perhaps are disposed towards criminality or towards drunkenness, epileptics, all these people should be disposed of for the advancement of the race. It's the kind thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. You see, this is the kind of thinking that undergirded progressivism. We are progressing, we're advancing towards great things as a society. We must do everything we can to advance societal evolution. And that's the idea here. The idea is there is this progress, this myth of progress, that there is this arc of history where man is progressing in his evolutionary development, and we must be a part of that and help it out if necessary. Of course, all of this is also related to something called eugenics, which was very popular amongst the progressives, the idea of either sterilizing or murdering those who are unfit, and thereby helping out human evolution, purifying the race. We see this progressing then. In 1906, the Ohio State Legislature actually seriously considered a law to legalize voluntary euthanasia. At least they were keeping it voluntary, but the idea is active euthanasia, that a doctor would put someone to death. However, fortunately, that law did not make it out of committee. But nonetheless, it was seriously considered. These kind of ideas were in the air in the early 1900s. Now, for a time after that, when progressivism, its fortunes started to sag, there was less talk in the 1920s about euthanasia. But then in the 1930s, you saw a dramatic revival of interest in this whole matter of euthanasia. For example, in 1938, something called the Euthanasia Society of America, ESA, which by the way still exists, this society was formed, and in its initial period of existence, it advocated not only voluntary euthanasia, but even involuntary euthanasia. This was to be applied to people with severe disabilities. Again, it's the humane thing to do. They're suffering anyway. We're putting them out of their misery. We're giving them a good death, which again is the meaning of the word euthanasia. This ESA also lobbied for forced sterilization, again, keeping with the eugenics culture. And, these ideas were seriously, once again, I want you to think about this, were seriously being advocated by serious, prominent people. Now, the involuntary euthanasia, that would soon be somewhat discredited by the criminal practices of the Third Reich. Of course, then comes the Third Reich, the great experiment. In 1939, the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, enacted something that he called the Actian T4 program. This was in October of 1939. Note the timing of this. It's 1 month after he begins World War II. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, with Hitler's invasion of Poland. But with the fog of war in the air, while the public would be distracted, Hitler enacted this program, which was designed to put to death people who were, quote, incurably ill, physically or mentally disabled, emotionally distraught, and elderly people, unquote. In other words, those whom the Fuhrer classified as, and here's a wonderful German expression, lebensunwertes Leben. I'll run that by you again. Lebensunwertes Leben, which means unworthy of life. There were certain people who were to be classified as unworthy of life. That was the expression. And this Actian T4 program, this came on the heels of an earlier sterilization campaign that had been inaugurated by the Nazi Interior Minister, Wilhelm Frick, who from 1933 to 1939, you had this sterilization program where people, unworthy people, were forcibly sterilized. But now they were taking it a step further. These people were to be put to death. Frick, by the way, was later convicted in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and executed as a Nazi war criminal. But this Actian T4 program, formally, it lasted 2 years, but actually it lasted 6 years, all the way through World War II, right up to the end of the war in 1945. 6 killing centers were established, the most notable one being at a place called Hadamar. At these centers, the so-called unfit, the mentally retarded, sick children, elderly people who were considered in a state where they would not be getting better and were a burden to the state in terms of their medical care. People such as this were taken to these centers, often under deceptive means. Sometimes a child would be taken out of the home, and the parent would be told that they would be taken to a treatment center, and then later a phony death certificate would be sent to the parent saying that the child died during treatment. A plausible but utterly phony cause of death was written on these death certificates. Indeed, as I was reading on this, it seems that the so-called doctors and medical staff at these places, most of their time was spent writing phony death certificates, because the fact is, once the person would arrive, they would be dispensed with very quickly. These killing centers actually served as a prototype for the extermination camps, the racial extermination camps, which were horrifically used against the Jews and against the Romani, the Gypsies, and other inferior races. Of course, we know at Auschwitz, there was a murder factory. You had millions dying, 6 million Jews altogether being liquidated by the regime. But these euthanasia centers were kind of the prototype. Usually poison gas was used. It was used first at the euthanasia centers. And then this is then later was used at the extermination camps. It's estimated in terms of the euthanasia program against the sick and the elderly and against the deformed and the disabled. It's estimated that 300,000 people were murdered during the 6 years of the Actian T4 program. That number, by the way, that has recently increased. We've learned more from documentation that actually more people were killed than what we even realized decades ago. But from August of 1939, in anticipation of all this, the Interior Ministry required that all children who were born with disabilities were to be registered with the state. All doctors and all midwives were required to report all cases of newborns who came into this world with severe disabilities. Many, many, many children were killed. Now, over time, some German parents began to grow wise as to what was happening. And as this program proceeded, the SS became so forward in this. If a parent complained about the removal of a child from the home, a child that was considered unworthy of life, the SS would very forthrightly tell the parents, unless you hand your child over, the other children in your home will be considered as being raised in an unfit home. They will be taken from you, and you will end up in a labor camp. So hand your unworthy one over now. Heil Hitler. It just became that brutal. And, sometimes you think you've read everything there is to read about Nazi Germany, but it's just astonishing how it seems like that there's always something new to learn, and that the evil of that regime truly was bottomless, incalculable, the evil, the suffering that was perpetrated by that government. And yet it all started sounding so nice. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, in conjunction with a number of SS doctors, they produced various movies that were designed to soften up the German people to accept this. For example, there was a film called Ich klage an, I Accuse, is the title. A very heartwarming film. One that was designed to stir the emotions. The story about, it was a movie about a Euthanasia. Euthanasia is the German term for good death or euthanasia. A mercy death, Gnadentod. Don't you love these euphemisms? But this film, which was commissioned by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, it tells the story of a physician who has a beautiful wife who comes down with multiple sclerosis, and she's suffering, and she begs to be put to death. And finally, the husband does so. And the film is meant to have this beautiful message about how people should be in charge of their own lives. Who are we to make people suffer? There's always this wonderful libertarian undergirding to it. People are autonomous and are free and should be in charge of their own destinies. Who are we to make other people suffer? How beautiful it sounds. And that's how it was presented. And then the doctor in the movie goes on trial and he says, Ich klage an, I accuse you, the German public and the courts, of making people suffer against their will. I believe in the right to die, a fundamental right to die with dignity. Oh, it sounds so beautiful, doesn't it? And yet it all led to the tearing down of all morals, of all guidelines, and ultimately to the specter of retarded children being pulled out of their parents' arms by the SS and being put to death against their will. You see, it all sounds so beautiful in the beginning, and how ugly it turns out when we dethrone God and we determine that human beings were not created in his image after all. How ugly the path turns once we just kick out the legs of civilization from underneath it. Well, with the Nazi abuses for a while, that was kind of a sobering effect on Western civilization, and for a while the euthanasia movement took a real black eye. Only for a while, however. Despite the decline in public support for euthanasia immediately following World War II, once again progressivism and the swinging 60s came back with a vengeance. The new morality interest revived in the 1960s, and in the 1970s in the so-called right to die movement. You saw some very high-profile cases, the Karen Ann Quinlan case, 1976, the Terry Schiavo case, 2005. Of course, all the controversy surrounding Dr. Jack Kevorkian, this doctor who made it a one-man mission to go around killing people. And, of course, now today you have this situation, again, as we came into this, various governments allowing for both euthanasia, active euthanasia, and for physician-assisted suicide. Of course, the most egregious offender in this is, as I said in the beginning, Canada. And again, in a future message, not next week, but I think the following one, we're going to get into just what we can expect on the road ahead if Canada is any measure of what happens when a society starts talking about how this libertarian right to die, where it ultimately ends up. Where it ends up is all manner of abuse. And that's what's going on right now in Canada, in Trudeau's paradise. People being, euthanasia literally being pushed, I mean aggressively pushed on families. Even families being told that they're selfish to cling to loved ones. We'll get you some documentation on that, by the way, in this upcoming message. But let's face it, friends, we abandon the living God, we abandon the ethics of his word, and only darkness awaits. Welcome to a brave new world. Well, friends, I think that's all I have for you today. It's a fascinating topic. It's a timely topic. It's one that I don't think has been given its due in terms of attention from the Christian public, and it's why we hope to rectify that through these messages. So, until next time, this is Pastor Terry Reese. May the Lord be with you.